Welcome back. In this section, we're going to be talking about database as a service. Now, within the scope of Azure, that entails quite a bit. Most application developers will immediately think of relational databases, and yes, Azure covers that. But there are also NoSQL databases. There are in-memory databases, single table databases. There are all kinds of different types of databases of service within the scope of Azure. So we'll start though by talking about the one that has been around the longest within Azure, and that's Azure SQL Standard. We'll then cover all of the different features, configurations, how it's set up, because it is one of the most heavily used databases as a service features inside of Azure. We'll also talk about how you can actually leverage Azure SQL to provide software as a service type applications where you have multiple databases for your one application, each customer potentially having their own small database, but you needing to manage all of them, and of course wanting to remove some of the management needs that Azure can do for you. We'll then move into some of the other relational database capabilities, focusing on MySQL and Postgres. We'll then start to talk about some NoSQL database capabilities where we're talking about Azure Table Storage, which is still a column-based database, but it's a single table. It's designed for high efficiency querying and high speed querying. We'll then move into looking at some of the more traditional NoSQL databases such as document databases and graph databases and how they are provided inside of Azure. And then lastly, we'll look at the in-memory database capabilities using Redis. So Redis is an open source based in-memory database. It is a standard key value pair based style database that can be stored in memory, provides very high efficiency, high speed, very low latency, and is used by a lot of software developers for static based content that is needed within the scope of your database. One good example is a list of zip codes or a list of area codes and their locations, things along those lines, state abbreviations and state names, things that do not change at all or hardly ever. So with that, let me go over into the portal first before we talk about what's coming in this specific video set and look at where the database services lie within the scope of Azure. So here we are in the portal. This should not look any different to you. It's got all of the same things that you've been seeing over time. One thing though that I want to start to look at is under the All Services, we're going to look at this databases category here. And we'll start by looking at the SQL databases, how they are deployed and made available. We'll talk very briefly about SQL Server stretch databases. I mentioned those in my second video series on hybrid operational management, where you can actually provide connectivity between an Azure SQL database and a on-prem SQL Server implementation and actually have them act as the same database, allowing you to provide for an archival off-site storage location but still maintain the same database, not having to do separate connection strings or things like that. As I mentioned at the end of the particular section, we're going to be talking about the Redis cache capabilities. We'll also look at the databases for MySQL and Postgres, and I think you'll find very quickly that they are very, very similar in the way that Azure SQL is deployed. And we've done that intentionally to make it easy for database administrators or developers who need to be able to swap back and forth between Azure SQL, MySQL, and Postgres. We'll talk about, of course, SQL Elastic Pools. One thing that we're not going to talk about, but I did want to bring up here by showing you this navigation set, is the Azure Database Migration Service. And this is something that's fairly new. It's only been around for about the last 6 to 9 months. And what it provides is for you to be able to easily move a on-prem database or a database from a colo or a private cloud or one of the other cloud vendors, and you need to move it from maybe the same database flavor to the same database flavor, or maybe you've made the decision that you want to move from Oracle to SQL Server. Working for Microsoft, I would applaud you for that. But maybe you're making that kind of a decision. The Azure Database Migration Service provides you a way to be able to easily map tables, relationships, views, procedures, functions, all of the standard things that are part of a relational database deployment, and move them from the deployment that's in, say, Oracle into SQL Server, and leveraging the correct syntax and formatting of how those things need to be done. And we'll help walk you through potentially changing or merging data types from one type in Oracle to another type that's in SQL Server, things along those lines. And it will do it for you in a much more automated fashion once the configuration has been put in place. Another item that we will not be talking about in this section or in this video series at all is SQL Data Warehouse. SQL Data Warehouse really falls under big data, artificial intelligence, data analysis, data reporting, which will more than likely be covered by someone with a stronger area of expertise in that. I am not a data expert, so I do not actually work a whole lot with SQL Data Warehouses, but they are available to be deployed as a service just like the Azure SQL Server databases are as well. Azure Cosmos DB is the primary location for NoSQL databases. So I mentioned right at the top that we were going to be looking at document-based databases as well as graph databases and how they can be deployed. And Azure Cosmos is going to be where that occurs. Data Factory is something we're going to be talking about in the next section of videos, where we're going to be looking at how you want to do ETL type processing, extract, transform, and load. Maybe you're needing to move data from a flat file into a specific database type system, or maybe you're needing to do conversions of data from one before the source or after it comes out of the source and before it hits the target. Data Factory is a type of system that can do that. It also has some automated plugins or integrations where you can get data out of FTP servers or REST APIs or log systems, things like that, and then put them into a source of your specific requirements. That is something that we will be looking at in the next section of videos when we talk about data processing as a service. And then the last thing I'll point out here is SQL servers. SQL servers are what backs all of the SQL databases, so they are required. And we will talk about that when we go into the creation of an Azure SQL database. So let me go back now over to the deck and we'll talk about what we're going to discuss in this specific video set. Okay, in this video set, we're going to focus on Azure SQL. Now this is going to be a multi-part video set because there are a lot of things to talk about with Azure SQL databases. In fact, to the point of where I created a separate video just to cover Elastic databases. But in this one, we're going to focus on the standard Azure SQL database, the relational database that you can get by deploying Azure SQL Server to an on-prem environment. It is now available as a service. And all of the features that are available in SQL Server Standard are available, or SQL Server Enterprise that you can be installing are available in the database as a service. The one thing to actually keep in mind here is our developers for SQL Server actually deploy for Azure first, or develop for Azure first. So the Azure SQL service actually gets all of the newest features before even the installed software set does via hotfix or updates. So that is one thing to keep in mind, especially for developers who are wanting to play around and use the newest services as they come out. In this video set, we're going to talk about what Azure SQL is, how it's deployed. We'll actually walk through the creation of a SQL database. We'll then talk about how the database can be configured, many of the managed database features. What I mean by that is, what are some of the things that Microsoft is taking away from what the database administrator used to have to do manually or in an automated fashion on a regular basis? What are those things that you can turn on or turn off to actually reduce the administrative burden for either your DBAs, your developers, or just your system administrators? And then what kind of performance monitoring is available for the Azure SQL service? So let's head back over to the portal and we'll go through the process of creating a new Azure SQL instance. Okay, so we're back in my portal, and you can actually see here that I already have a SQL database created, and I'm actually not going to click the create button when we go through this creation process. I just want to walk you through it. I created one earlier because it does take a little bit of time, and I wanted to have one ready for when we go through the configuration process. But what exactly is Azure SQL? At the end of the day, It is a combination of two resources deployed in Azure. One is a server, standard VM type deployment. You don't have the same level of control over the VMs like you do if you were to install your own VMs yourself, but a server does exist behind the database, and then one or more databases that are actually deployed to that server. So really the server is the same thing as you deployed SQL Server 2016's image out of the Azure Marketplace. And then the Azure service is deploying databases on top of that. Now, it is not a one-to-one. It can absolutely be a many-to-one type relationship, but it is completely up to you. Now, let's go through the actual process of creating a SQL database. So I've got mine existing here. Let me click Add. First thing is I'm just going to give it a name. You're then, of course, going to choose your subscription. You're going to choose a resource group, just like you do with everything. And then you're going to choose a data source. Now, you can either choose a blank database, a sample database, which is one that SQL has been providing with itself for many, many years, or if you happen to have copied a backup from, say, your on-prem SQL environment to a storage account inside of Azure, then you can absolutely choose backup. At which point then it will walk you through the process of finding that backup, and it will do a restore of that database into your SQL database as it's being created. You're then going to choose a server. So as I mentioned, it does require that a server exist behind these databases. You'll see I already have a server created, and this is the server that I created when I went through the process of creating my other database a little while ago. But let me show you exactly here. I've got my server here, and if I click create, it's only going to take a few parameters. The server name, the admin user ID and password, and this is the SA user ID and password that gets installed as part of the SQL Server software. And then you choose a location, and that's it. So you don't have any even remotely close to the number of options for specifying sizes of the VMs. It's actually going to do it for you based off of the pricing tier that you choose in a little bit for your SQL database. Now, as I mentioned, it is not a one-to-one relationship. So even though I'm creating a new database here, I can absolutely deploy it on my existing server. So if we continue to scroll down, the next option is whether or not you are deploying SQL Elastic pools. We'll talk about that in the next video, so I'm not going to dive into it now. It is a very different style of database management. The databases are still relational databases of SQL 2016. The next thing is the pricing tier, and this is very different from any other pricing tier that we have looked at in any of my other video series. All of the other videos are specified, say, per hour or per gig. They are very straightforward and very easy to understand. In networking, it's usually bandwidth, things like that. In the case of databases, though, and this is true whether it's SQL database, MySQL, Postgres, data warehouse, the pricing is based off of a database unit. In this particular case, it's a database transaction unit. In data warehouse, it is a database warehouse unit. And it is a combination of a few different things to create a formula. And actually, you can click here, and here is the documentation explaining what a database transaction unit is. It is a blended measure of CPU, memory, and I/O. So using that, Microsoft has come up with a set of VMs that will provide this level of database transaction unit, or provide the number of database transaction units that are specified in the given tiers. Now, there are three distinct tiers, as you see here. There's a basic tier, standard, and premium. Most customers for small to mid-size databases or small to mid-size applications stick with standard. But when we start to talk about enterprise class applications, software as a service applications, or applications that are going to be geo-redundant and spread across many thousands of users like you would think of in a company the size of Microsoft, you then start to look at premium tier databases. And you can see the different DTU gaps. In basic, you're getting 5 DTUs, perfect for development purposes, where you're only going to have 1, 2, maybe 3 users that are actually going to be hitting the database at any one particular time. And then you can specify the storage for the 5 DTUs, anywhere from 100 meg to 2 gigs for the database size. That's the storage for the database size. You then have standard, which is anywhere from 10 DTUs up to 3,000, and you're getting anywhere from 100 meg to 250 gigs worth of available database storage. The last one is for premium, very I/O intensive. You're getting 125 DTUs up to 4,000, and anywhere up to 1 terabyte of database in storage. So you're going to choose one of these tiers. You're then going to specify the different level of DTU. So you can see here, as I scroll up, it gives me different DTU sizes and specifies the tiering. So as you can see, this is S9 at 1600. I can actually go all the way up to 3000, which is an S12. The problem is once you get a database that has more than 200, you are going to be required to accept a terms of service for this particular style database. The reasoning because anything over 100 at the standard level is new, it's still in preview, it is absolutely available to the general public, but you are required to accept the preview terms of service first. At the premium level, as you can see here, we can go all the way up to P15s, which is your 4,000, and then you, of course, can specify your database size. You'll also notice that once you get to the higher level of premiums, you actually go up to 4 terabytes of available database storage. And, of course, the prices go up as you choose your tiers. So I'm going to go back to my standard. I'm going to put it all the way down to 10. I'm not going to finish this anyway, but I did at least want to walk you through. And I highly recommend you looking at the documentation explaining what a DTU actually stands for. And I will provide the link at the end of the section. So I go ahead and I click apply. The last thing is specifying the collation. So for your specific database, do you want to use a different collation from the default that SQL Server normally deploys? And SQL Latin 1 General is the one that it normally deploys for all databases. But having worked with customers all around the world, I can tell you there are many customers who absolutely will choose a different collation because of their base language. So that is something you will need to know what the actual text is. You'll notice it is not a drop-down box. So you'll need to be able to pull that from SQL Server and make sure that you put in the correct one, especially if you're importing a backup of an existing database. You'll also, of course, need to do that if you're using the database migration service to move data from your on-prem environment to Azure SQL. So just some things for you to keep in mind. But these are the parameters that are required for creating of an Azure SQL database, as well as the server that sits behind it. Now, you do have full access to manage, quote unquote, the server that sits behind it. In other words, you're going to be able to get performance metrics about it and things like that, but you will not be able to change the VM size dynamically like you can with a standard VM. So with that,